Good afternoon, everybody. This is William Boyle from UCLA, and I'm here to introduce today's webinar. We have Dr. Jennifer Shieh from NHLBI, who I'll introduce in a second. This is part of an ongoing series of webinars that are being hosted by the University of California Center for Accelerated Innovations. And these webinars are really based on skills development, particularly focused on bringing new products to the market based on research and development. The topics in the past have ranged from discovery and development of therapeutics, both small and large molecule, topics covering intellectual property and licensing and technology commercialization strategies. And these are all, I should say, hosted at the UCCAI website. You can go to uccai.ctsi.ucla.edu. Like all of our presentations, we're going to be recording these, so if you missed today, or you can listen in later, or tell your colleagues to come to that site. As way of our background, Jennifer has really been involved in the SBIR, STTR program. She actually is a scientist by training. She studied brain and cognitive sciences at MIT, went on to do her PhD at neurosciences at Stanford. She's been in the business environment, was basically involved with a startup company in the area of precision medicine. She has since gone on to be program director at the NCAI SBIR Development Center, and is now currently the small business coordinator and program director at NHLBI, and she helps small businesses commercialize technologies focused on heart, lung, blood, and sleep disorders. So before we, Jennifer, really look forward to hearing your presentation after seeing the slides, and really, you know, this is such a delight to have you here. This is such an important funding mechanism that small businesses and startups are using to support product development. So Jennifer?
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to UCLA and the UC Center for Accelerated Innovations for hosting me today. I'll be focusing on the small business programs and resources that are available from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, but a lot of this information is very broadly applicable to the NIH small business programs overall. So let's get straight to the point of why you're here today. Money. The NIH has an annual budget of $30 billion to support basic and applied biomedical science, $786 million of which goes to small businesses that are working to improve human health through the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Programs, or SBIR and STTR. The SBIR and STTR programs are the largest source of seed stage funding in the United States. Companies like MedImmune, Affymetrix, and Sonicare all received early funding through the small business programs at NIH. So the NIH is the National Institutes of Health, and we're made up of 27 different institutes and centers that focus on different organ systems and diseases. I represent the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. We're the third largest with a $3.1 billion annual budget to advance research and development for the heart, lung, blood, and sleep space. This translates to $87 million for small businesses working on technologies in our mission space. So, what are the SBIR and STTR programs, and how are they different? Both the SBIR and STTR programs support collaboration between small businesses and universities, but while the small SBIR program allows for this type of partnering, the STTR program requires it. Generally, the two primary reasons why an applicant chooses STTR over SBIR would be due to the PI's employment and how much work might need to be done at a partnering research institution. For SBIR, the PI needs to be primarily employed by the small business at the time of award. But for STTR, the PI could either be employed by the small business or the research institution partner, meaning the PI could keep their faculty appointment and still be the sole PI for an STTR award, but not for SBIR. However, both SBIR and STTR do allow for multiple PIs, so as long as for an SBIR there's a co-PI that is employed by the business, a faculty member could actually be a co-PI for an SBIR award. With regards to the budget, for SBIR, generally in phase 1, the small business needs to perform 2/3 of the work based on the budget, leaving only 1/3 to be subcontracted out. This goes up to 50% for a phase 2 SBIR. With STTR, for both phase 1 and phase 2, there's a requirement that the small business performs a minimum of 40% of the work based on the budget. The research institution partner performs a minimum of 30% of the work, and then that leaves 30% of the budget to go either to the small business or the research institution partner or to another third-party subcontractor. So one of the questions that we get very frequently is which one has a better chance of getting funded? And that's actually a very hard question to answer. The STTR program is smaller than the SBIR program, so there's less money there overall. But there are also often fewer applications. And because of the smaller size of the STTR program, there's just a lot more noise in the success rates than with SBIR. So one year might be better, the next year might be worse. And it varies depending on the particular institute at NIH. What's important is to choose the right mechanism for your budget and management structure. And remember that for both SBIR and STTR, the small business concern is always the applicant or awardee organization. There are a few additional special requirements for the STTR program. The PI must commit a minimum of 10% effort to the project and have an official relationship with the small business. Now, this official relationship doesn't necessarily involve a salary or payment, but it does need to allow for the PI to carry out her responsibilities for the overall scientific and technical direction of the project. That 10% effort is NIH wanting to make sure that there's actually enough time among the PI's total professional commitments to actually devote to moving this project forward. Documentation that describes the formal relationship between the business and the PI is not submitted with the application, but what is submitted is a letter of support from the partnering research institution that certifies they'll be performing at least 30% of the work there. Another common question that we get is around the intellectual property requirements for these applications. For the SBIR program, there's no formal NIH requirement for the small business to have a license agreement or even an option prior to applying for funding. For STTR applications, the small business concern is required to have a written agreement that allocates IP rights to them to carry out follow-on research, development, or commercialization at the time of award. This agreement is also not submitted with the application itself, but it would need to be provided if it's requested by NIH. There's a model STTR agreement for allocation of rights on the NIH website, and a number of universities also have examples posted online. So although neither the SBIR nor the STTR application process requires proof that the small business has executed a license agreement or option in the application itself, it can be helpful to address the IP question head-on, since reviewers are instructed to look at commercial potential. For phase 1 applications, while there isn't much space in the research plan to go into a lot of detail, you can at least mention the status of the IP and include letters of support from the Tech Transfer Office, for example, that describe details a little more fully. For phase 2 applications, the commercialization plan does explicitly ask for information about IP protection. So you have a great idea, and there are these two primary decisions you need to think about. Are you applying for SBIR or STTR, and what type of application? So we just talked about SBIR and STTR, but what do I mean by type of application? What I mean is whether you're applying for phase 1 and 2 at the same time, or phase 2. Now, just to be clear, because I know some of you are probably working on therapeutics projects, this is not related at all to the phase 1 and 2 clinical trials. This is just phases of the SBIR and STTR programs. So phase 1 is generally up to $225,000 for 6 months to a year's worth of work, focused on gathering proof of concept data. The application for phase 1 is a 6-page research plan and doesn't require any preliminary data, though, of course, it can help make your application more competitive. It's important to design quantitative, concrete milestones for your phase 1 research so that at the end of that phase, you have a clear go, no-go decision point. Typically, after you've gathered phase 1 feasibility data, then you'd apply for phase 2 support to continue that work. The phase 2 application involves a 12-page research plan where you include your phase 1 results. Importantly, the phase 2 application also includes a 12-page commercialization plan where you detail the commercial applications of your research, your market segments, competitive landscape, IP protection, your regulatory strategy, and just generally your company's plan for becoming a successful commercial entity. So with the traditional phased route, you would submit a phase 1 application, do the work, then submit phase 2 for peer review again. Phase 3 is considered commercialization, and NIH does not typically fund phase 3 because we're not your ultimate customer for what you're developing. Though some other agencies that participate in the SBIR and STTR programs, like the Department of Defense or NASA, do use non-SBIR funds to support commercialization. So you can also submit a FastTrack application, which is where you apply for both phase 1 and 2 funding at the same time. This means that you're submitting a 12-page research plan that describes both your phase 1 as well as your phase 2 research strategies. You'll also be submitting a full 12-page commercialization plan. What you're asking scientific peer review to do here is comment on the entire application, phase 1 and 2 together, without actually seeing any phase 1 results. The fast track can be an attractive option because it can help eliminate a possible funding gap that might exist between the end of your phase 1 award and the start of phase 2. If you receive a fast track award, when you complete your phase 1 work, it will be administratively reviewed by the institute that awarded it to determine if you've met your phase 1 milestones. And so this is why it's especially critical to have clear quantitative milestones in a fast track application so that the peer reviewers are comfortable that it'd be obvious enough, even for a government bureaucrat, if you've met them or not, if you've met those milestones or not, in order to be approved by program staff to move on to phase 2. There's also a relatively new option for more advanced companies who may already have proof of concept data funded through a source other than the SBIR or STTR program, and that's the direct to phase 2 option. Here you would submit a 12-page research plan that includes a description of the feasibility work that you consider to be equivalent to phase 1 progress. You submit a full commercialization plan as well. The main distinction between a fast track application and a direct to phase 2 application is that for a fast track, you've not done the phase 1 proof of concept work yet, and you're describing your plan for that work. With direct to phase 2, you have already completed phase 1-like proof of concept work, and you include those results in addition to describing what you plan to do in phase 2 to build on that data. For companies with a fair amount of preliminary data, considering either the fast track or direct to phase 2 application, how do you know which is right for you? One consideration is whether you have specific research aims that make sense to fit into the budget and time period of a phase 1 award. If you do, and there's a clear go, no-go decision point with the completion of those aims, the fast track might be appropriate. If you have any questions about what might fit better for you, just contact us. So even though NIH does not fund phase 3, we know that even after phase 2, there's often more work to be done. So for some institutes at NIH, phase 2 awardees can apply for a phase 2B competing renewal award. Different institutes have different policies. Some advertise through the omnibus, and some, like NHLBI, have a special Phase 2B program. So at NHLBI, our special Phase 2B program supports products that require FDA clearance or approval. We have two distinct funding opportunities. The Phase 2B Small Market Award focuses on supporting projects that are targeted to rare diseases and pediatric populations. This funding comes with an expectation that you'd bring in at least a third of the funds you're requesting from NHLBI. So if you're asking for $3 million, you'd bring in at least $1 million from external investors or strategic partners. For projects in the NHLBI mission space that aren't focused on rare or pediatric indications, we have the Phase 2B Bridge Award that comes with an expectation of a 1-to-1 match. These programs are designed to be used as a way to encourage outside investors to come in earlier in product development and leverage the non-dilutive NHLBI funds that your project is getting. So now you have a sense of whether to do SBIR or STTR, maybe what stage of development you're in. So how do you find a funding opportunity that fits with your great idea? There are three general types of funding opportunities: investigator-initiated grants, targeted grant funding opportunities, and contract funding opportunities. The majority of applications that come into NIH are funded through our investigator-initiated funding opportunity, the omnibus solicitation. This is generally open to any topic related to the NIH mission. All of the institutes and centers that have a small business program participate in the omnibus solicitation. So when you're submitting an application to one of these funding opportunities, you're really submitting to all of NIH. And you can read more about the specific topics that each institute covers in the program descriptions and research topics document. There are 3 standard due dates each year: September 5th, January 5th, and April 5th. Because this upcoming September 5th is actually on a weekend and then the Labor Day holiday follows, the actual receipt date is September 8th. And I just want to point out that the omnibus solicitations there are separate funding opportunity announcements for the SBIR program compared to the STTR program. And there's a separate funding opportunity and solicitation for the Direct to Phase 2 program, and that is SBIR only. So at NHLBI, we do welcome all your innovative ideas that are related to heart, lung, blood, and sleep, but we do publish certain topics that are of special interest to the Institute. These aren't separate funding announcements. It's really just to let the community know that there are some areas we're particularly interested in seeing come through our investigator-initiated funding opportunities and through the omnibus. But we do also put our money where our mouths are and have targeted grant funding opportunities for areas that the Institute feels are important. These may have special application instructions, review criteria, and different budget guidance. A few of the targeted funding opportunities that we have right now at NHLBI with upcoming due dates include the bioreactors for reparative medicine to support the development of complex 3D engineering systems to grow heart, lung, or bone marrow tissue, support for research using advanced technologies to develop novel point-of-care devices and implement existing technologies in clinical settings in order to guide diagnostic or therapeutic efforts in heart, lung, blood, or sleep disorders. Funding for the development and validation of novel in vitro human cell-based tools to predict the responses of individual cystic fibrosis patients to therapeutics that are directed at the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. And support for the development of improved techniques and tools to enhance the production of clinically relevant functional stem cell-derived blood products in a more efficient and cost-effective manner so that it enables the production of clinically viable stem cell-based therapies. There's a lot of variety in the targeted grant funding opportunities that are offered by different institutes and centers at NIH. So the best thing to do is really check the website and sign up for the listservs of the particular institute where you might find relevant funding opportunities. And I didn't put the specific numbers for those funding opportunities at NHLBI out, but you can go to our website and look at the targeted funding opportunity announcements list. You can also search the NIH Guide and sign up for the weekly funding announcement emails. The NIH SBIR website is also a really good resource if you're specifically seeking SBIR and STTR funding. Beyond that, it's actually also a great resource for just learning more about different aspects of the SBIR and STTR programs at NIH. And they have a great frequently asked questions section that can answer many of your frequently asked questions. So finally, the third type of small business funding vehicle is the annual SBIR contract solicitation. These have a very different application and award process from grants, and the topics are typically much more narrow and milestone-driven than grants. The NHLBI does award contract topics, and I encourage you to sign up for next Thursday's webinar if you're interested in learning more about the contract process at NIH and how it differs from the grants process. This year, there are 38 different topics that are put out for contracts from a number of different institutes at NIH, as well as the Centers for Disease Control. There are 4 topics that NHLBI is supporting around cardiovascular devices, as well as tools to detect and monitor injury due to cardiotoxicity. So you've identified a funding opportunity. Now what? Well, number one, and I can't reiterate this enough, read the whole funding opportunity announcement. But also, reach out to program staff with your questions. On the funding opportunity announcement, or FOA, if I slip and start using acronyms, FOA is funding opportunity announcement, there's a section that lists who to contact. If you're not sure what institute your work might be relevant for, and you're thinking about applying for the investigator-initiated omnibus solicitations, for example, you can look at the program descriptions and research topics document that accompanies the omnibus, but you can also search previous awards. The NIH Reporter website is a database of all NIH awards. You can put a summary or specific aims into the Matchmaker tab and find out what projects have been funded by NIH that are like yours. You can find out what institute funded them and even what study section they went to. So this can really help find where to start with who to contact. The NIH SBIR site has a list of all the SBIR contacts for the different institutes. And if you send it to somebody and they say it's not really relevant for their institute, they'll probably help you find who it is relevant for. The NIH Reporter tool can also be really useful for competitive intelligence to see who else is working on similar projects or to find potential collaborators. So armed with your idea, the funding opportunity announcement information, and information about previous awards, contact us. Our job is to help the best science get commercialized through this process, and we want to help you navigate it. If you're applying for a small business award, reach out. The best thing to do is to send an email with your draft-specific aims and questions that you have, so we can be sure that we're putting you in contact with the right people. At NHLBI, we have a team with people from many different areas of expertise. So depending on your questions, you may want to talk to me or to a scientific program official or a grants management specialist. At NHLBI, we also have a regulatory strategist and a business development advisor. You can always reach out to me and I will help you find out who's the best person to answer your questions. In general, the SBIR coordinator for each institute at NIH should be able to either just answer your question directly or know who to pass it on to, but we do need some background to figure that out. Registration. So this part, in the little diagram here is theoretically after you contact us, but really it's in parallel and you can get started on this right now, and I recommend that. So for both the SBIR and STTR programs, remember that the applicant is the small business. So the company does need to be a legal entity, regardless of whether it's an individual proprietorship, an LLC, or a corporation. And then that company needs to go through a number of different registrations. Some of these things can take weeks to complete and are dependent on other steps. So really, you should just go ahead, get the registrations out of the way so you don't spend all your time developing a great research plan only to not be able to submit your application in time for the deadline. This is something that might be pretty different from what you're used to if you're preparing an NIH grant with an academic institution, because universities generally are the ones taking care of the institutional side of the registration. Okay, so you've registered, you're ready to put together your application. Read the whole funding opportunity announcement. In particular, as you're putting your application together, you'll want to pay particular close attention to Section 4, the application and submission information, and Section 5, review criteria. So in Section 4, particularly if you're going to be applying for a targeted grant funding opportunity, there's often different information that's requested to put into the application. But all of the funding opportunity announcements, we try to put in what it is we're looking for. And looking at the review criteria while you're developing the application really helps, because if you think about what reviewers are asked to do, you want to be sure that you have answers in there to help them. So the 5 scored review criteria are significance, innovation, approach, investigator, and environment. These scored review criteria are the same at a high level as R01 or other NIH grants, but read each of the questions carefully under those criteria. For significance, reviewers are asked to look at the commercial potential in SBIR and STTR grants. So you'll need to show both that there's a significant unmet medical and market need, that you have an innovative solution to that unmet need, that your approach to developing the solution is realistic with clear quantitative milestones, and that you're the right people to do it with the right resources. It can be particularly helpful if you organize your own study section and get colleagues who aren't too close to the project to read through your application, see if they're compelled by the arguments you're laying out. And of course, understanding review can really help, or you can really understand review better if you volunteer and participate in a study section as a reviewer yourself. So there are generally 2 routes for review, but the Center for Scientific Review, which is the website that I have up here, Center for Scientific Review handles most of the review for the NIH. And they have a lot of good resources on their website. In addition to the funding opportunity announcement, you should download and read this SF424 application guide. If you have a question about what to put where or what something means in the application as you're trying to fill it out, the answer is likely to be found in this SF424 application guide. And I openly admit that as much as I try to respond to my emails in a timely manner, my responses are probably slower than what you could find if you just pulled up the SF424 and looked up the answer in that or in the frequently asked questions section at sbir.nih.gov. Another useful resource when you're filling out the application is the annotated application form. So this is the application form itself, and actually has little notes about what you need to put in where, and some of these things you don't need to worry about. So it's useful to use these annotated application forms to see what the instructions are and where you're supposed to put what. All right, so you've applied, and now comes the waiting game. So in red here, we've got peer review and the funding decisions, and that's where your application is hanging out at NIH. And I'm just putting up the review slide again because the Center for Scientific Review does have some useful videos and educational resources on their website that shows you what happens during peer review. So the little screenshot of a YouTube video on there, CSR actually did a mock study section, and it's kind of nice to know what's going on with your application after you send it off into the ether. So making funding decisions is another place where you're going to continue to wait. However, after peer review happens, you will get a summary statement that has the reviewer's comments about your application. And after that, you should, when you get your summary statement, you can contact the program contact who's listed in the upper left-hand corner of that front page to find out what your strategy should be going forward. Usually you'll see either a priority score, or you might see what's two little symbols, a little plus plus, that just means it wasn't discussed at the full study section. And if you go to csr.nih.gov, you can understand a bit more about what those things mean, and what your chances are for getting funded based on some of the scoring criteria and the comments. One thing actually I meant to mention here with the Center for Scientific Review is that after you submit your application and it gets assigned to a particular study section, the PI of the grant should have access to be able to see when the study section is going to be happening, as well as who is on that study section. If you feel like you are assigned to the wrong study section, or there's not the right type of expertise, or maybe you've identified somebody on that study section who's got a conflict of interest, you can reach out to the scientific review officer at that point to ask them about what the issues are, or possibly get reassigned. So how long, well, after we make the funding decisions, then once you get the award, you're doing the R&D work, but you also do have the task of managing finances for the company, and that can be a whole very long webinar in and of itself. So we will not talk about it today, but know that that does get sometimes a bit complicated if you're starting your own company. So how long does all of this take? Well, if you apply for the next September deadline, the reviews will happen around November. Council review will happen in January, February, and the earliest award date would be in March. So just to go over these 6 tips on applying again, remember, read the entire funding opportunity announcement. Search for previous awards using the NIH Reporter website. Contact us early, more than a month ahead of the deadline, because then actually we can give you advice and talk to you a bit more about things that you can then incorporate into and change your application. Make sure you do your registrations early. Have an understanding of what the review criteria are and what the reviewers are looking for, and use the SF424 application guide. It is a few hundred pages long, but it does have a lot of answers. So I'm going to go and talk a little bit more about contacting program staff. Excuse me. So at the NHLBI, who do I mean? Well, we actually at NHLBI have a unique way that we run our small business programs. We have the Office of Translational Alliances and Coordination with staff members who have scientific backgrounds, as well as experience and interest in the business of science. So our greatest resource is our staff. And if you're working in the heart, lung, blood, or sleep space, we have advisory experts that you can tap into by emailing NHLBI_SBIR@mail.nih.gov with your questions and a bit of background. We have Chris Sastiella, who's our regulatory strategist. We have Gary Robinson, our business development advisor. We have Gautam Prakash, who we're borrowing from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to provide advice on intellectual property. We have a couple of entrepreneurs in residence who have experience in product development. And we have an investor in residence who's an experienced angel investor and entrepreneur. Our advisory experts want to share their knowledge, but they know they can't talk to everyone. So they've actually created a very useful series of small biz hangouts that cover the basics of biomedical product development. And these are useful to anyone regardless of whether you're working in our mission space or not. They cover general regulatory, commercialization, and intellectual property issues. If you're thinking of writing a fast track or direct to phase 2 application, you should definitely watch Gary's Writing Your Phase 2 Commercialization Plan Hangout. And all of these are archived on the NHLBI YouTube channel, which you can access in that link right up there. Or just search for Small Biz Hangouts, NHLBI Small Biz Hangouts on YouTube. NHLBI also supports a number of resource programs for investigators in developing their technologies, and they're available to both academic investigators as well as companies, whether funded through SBIR or not. BioLink provides access to sample sets that are linked to clinical data, can be useful to support an IDE or marketing application with the FDA. NHLBI also provides IND-enabling in-kind services such as GMP manufacturing or GLP pharm tox testing for gene therapy or small molecules, biologics, or other therapeutic modalities. These programs can increase the value of your technology at no cost to you. These resources also have a faster timeline for learning about a decision than the traditional funding timeline. You can apply and find out if you're eligible within a month. In addition to the small business programs, I did want to mention that NHLBI has a number of funding opportunities for translational research. And I wanted to point out one current opportunity called VITA, Vascular Interventions or Innovations and Therapeutic Advances, because the letter of intent is due tomorrow. So you should check out this solicitation if you're working anywhere in the vascular intervention space. And proposals for those are due October 5th. So starting with the lab in the lab to market transition, the Office of Translational Alliances and Coordination coordinates 2 proof of concept center programs at academic institutions that hopefully you're very familiar with. These are designed to provide funding, access to expertise, and education, like these skills development series, so that innovators like you can find the support you need to get your scientific discoveries started down the path of commercial development to improve human health. You're here because of the skills development series at the UC Centers for Accelerated Innovation. In the NIH Centers for Accelerated Innovation, or NCAI program, or maybe you're here because of the NIH Research Evaluation and Commercialization Hub, or REACH program. These are really important networks that connect you with the expertise and experience of the private sector and the federal government to inform your business case around the science, adding industry-style project management with go, no-go milestones so you can learn and do what you need to translate your technology. And then in the end, technology that goes through a center or hub will be de-risked with a well-designed business case primed for licensing out or forming a startup company around that can then apply for SBIR or STTR funding. And these 3 centers merge the strengths of 14 research institutions in Boston, Ohio, and California. The 3 hubs are based in New York, Kentucky, and Minnesota. You should definitely look out for calls to apply for the funding opportunities, as well as the many classes and entrepreneurial support that the centers and hubs have to offer. I want to end with an invitation to meet with us in person. At NHLBI, we want to help support our small business awardees meeting potential follow-on investors and partners. So we've created the NHLBI Innovation Conferences. And this November 17th, we'll be holding our next one at the UC Irvine Institute for Innovation. So if you're in the Southern California region, we're also working with the UCLA CAI on having an in-person educational session with one-on-one meetings the day before the conference on November 16th. So stay tuned for that. And we welcome you to stay connected with us through Twitter and our listserv. We put out a lot of what we hope are very useful tidbits of information and we certainly welcome suggestions for any other kinds of information you're looking for. And with that, I think I'm turning it back over to see what you learned. The awardee institution of a small business innovation research, and that should be an or, small business technology transfer grant can be, and the answer is a small business. So the awardee is always a small business. So can an academic faculty member keep their academic position and be the PI for a small business technology transfer grant? Yes, so this is true. So to apply for an SBIR or STTR grant, well, I guess I'll tell you the answer first, and then we can just kind of talk a little bit about some of these other ones. But the answer is D. The company only requires that it has an active system for award management registration, as well as some of the other registrations in order to apply for an SBIR or STTR grant. You don't need an approved and licensed patent for the technology, though, of course, talking about your IP strategy can definitely help in your application. You don't need dedicated lab space for the company at the time that you're applying, but you do, because environment is one of the criteria that is reviewed, you will want to need to talk about what space the company has for when you have the award. But we don't make you start paying for rent for space before you even have an award. For the SBIR program, you do need a PI that is primarily employed by the company, but not for the STTR program. So who should you contact if you have questions about applying for an SBIR or STTR award? This is actually somewhat of a tricky question because essentially I think I would go with all of the above, but really it depends on what you're asking about. So with the scientific review officer, you can contact them, but generally it's going to be if you have questions about your assigned study section or the composition of the expertise on the study section, for example. You do want to talk to a program officer in a scientific division because they can often provide some guidance and useful advice about your research aims. The grants management specialist, there's a list of all the SBIR coordinator contacts as well as grants management specialists who are very familiar with the SBIR and STTR programs on the NIH SBIR website. And you'll want to contact that person if you have questions related to the budget, for example, and what's allowed and what's not allowed in your application. But for any of these questions, or if you have a whole bunch of questions, you can definitely contact us at the Office of Translational Alliances and Coordination if you're working in the heart, lung, blood, or sleep space. We'll help make sure that your questions get answered. We can answer some of these other questions and get you connected to the right program officer. So I'd go with E, and we'll take other questions. So maybe I can try to prove my mettle at answering some of these questions.
For the upcoming 2016 fiscal year, what will be the pay line for NHLBI SBIR grants?
So NHLBI does pay by pay line, and we have a published pay line each year. We don't have, it's not yet been set for FY 2016, but if you go to our funding guidelines page, you can see what the historical numbers have been. It's usually not set until after at least the first council review of the fiscal year, so that'll be after October.
The application has a box for filling in the CFDA code number. Is that filled by the small business or the funding agency?
So this is a great reason to look at the SF424 application guide as well as the annotated SF424 form, because both of those can answer that question. But I will answer it quickly, which is you do not have to worry about that number. It's filled in by the agency.
Do all complete submitted applications receive written reviewer feedback? We submitted in the spring and did not receive any feedback aside from not discussed.
So all of the applications that get reviewed do receive written comments back on your application. The ones that are discussed will generally get their summary statements a little bit quicker because if an application is not discussed, it is not eligible for funding, and so it takes a little bit longer sometimes, but you will eventually get your summary statements and written comments.
If a project grows to a successful business and the PI moves from the university to the company, how is IP handled?
So that is something that the PI and the university need to work out. And it's generally good to try to work that out ahead of time, in the case that might happen, and negotiate with your tech transfer office. But NIH does not have a specific direction on what we are telling universities or PIs to do. So it's up to your institution's policies.
Is the 30% max for outsourcing in SBIR defined as any funds not going to the small business, or is there a more nuanced definition?
Yeah, so that is a very good question, and it's a frequent one, especially with the move towards more virtual companies these days. So it is a more nuanced definition. The definition is really about so let's take the phase 1 SBIR situation of up to 33% can be subcontracted out. That is based on who's doing the research and analytical effort. And so, for example, if a company was hiring another company to manufacture a piece for their medical device that they're developing, but the company is the one that had the intellectual input, designed the piece, and they were really just getting this other company to produce that piece. That could be considered part of the company's 2/3 of the budget and counted as perhaps materials and supplies, for example. I mean, I can go a little bit more into that if you like, but so if you are collaborating with someone and really their intellectual input is what's critical, then you should probably consider that to be a subcontract.
Okay. What should be done when a reviewer writes none noted under weaknesses, but gives 5 points to that item?
Unfortunately, that is very difficult, and the scientific review officers do try to instruct the reviewers that if they're going to score something lower, that they provide weaknesses and information for the applicant to address. I mean, I think one of the best things to do would be to reach out to the program contact and talk about kind of ask these questions specifically for your summary statement.
A concern commonly raised is that no mechanism of action studies are proposed. These are irrelevant for SBIR feasibility and commercial development studies. What can be done about this?
So a lot of the SBIR and STTR applications, or actually really any NIH application for funding, what you're trying to do is make a good case and provide a lot of evidence for why you're doing what you're doing. And I would say if you don't think that the mechanism of action studies are needed for the development of the product that you're working on, one of the things that may help is to provide a lot of the rationale for why you're doing what you're doing, or that you may be funding some of these other studies through other means. But looking at, for example, the regulatory pathway that is needed for the development of your product, and tying that regulatory pathway into the aims that you're proposing to do, can help create a stronger argument for why it is you're proposing to do what you're doing, and explaining, why you don't need certain studies.
Standard IP processes are defined by UC in our employment contracts. However, if creating a company from this work, are IP rights and/or profit-sharing plans open to separate negotiations specific to the product?
I think that's more of a question for, I think that they were saying the UC system has the standard process. Yeah. So again, NIH doesn't have, we are not prescriptive about how the IP is handled. So that is really up to your institution and you to work on a good way to facilitate the creation of companies and transfer of technology.
What percentage of SBIR grants are actually funded?
So the success rates currently are around 10 to 15% for NIH overall.
Does NHLBI require a 1-to-3 match in the small market award mechanism because pediatrics and rare diseases are higher risk endeavors?
Yeah, so it's a 1-to-3 match rather than a 1-to-1 match because we do understand that it's more difficult to find external investors for these types of indications. But we do think it's still critical to help companies find follow-on funding and get that, that first investor in that can then help raise additional funds for the further development of the technology.